Susan, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
All right, well, great to see you. We just had a connection from the field in Kenya with Old Pejeta Conservancy. We got to see some of the rhinos and hear about their conservation work. And we're excited to learn a little bit more about the conservation work that you do. So I will give a nice little intro as we get started, but a quick reminder, we would like to see you live on social media using the hashtags Global BioFest as well as Backyard Bio. Get outside, take some pictures, post them on Instagram and Twitter. We want to see some animals in your front yards, your backyards, and all around. And if I take a quick look at our global picture here, oops, I closed it. Open it there. We have groups joining us all over the place right now. Of course, Canada, the US, the UK, but we've also got groups in Switzerland, South Africa, Slovenia, Namibia, India, Germany, Australia, Norway, just to name a few. So thank you so much to the global audience that's joining us. Use the Slido rooms. If you go to the speaker page, you can find the bios for every speaker. Each one has a link to their Slido room. Send us in some questions and we'll work those in a small discussion at the end. All right. So Susan Canney has worked on a variety of international nature conservation projects and in sustainable development policy at the Green College Center. She's interested in system perspectives and collaborative approaches to find sustainable solutions to conservation. So the dry adapted elephants of the Gourma region of Mali make a vast natural or annual migration through harsh, open landscapes. And so she's going to talk a little bit today about how this population has survived when others around have disappeared. So Susan, it's so great to have you joining us from the UK today. We're going to let you take over. You let me know when you want me to share screen, and let's rock and roll.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really exciting to join such a great festival. And thank you to everybody for tuning in to hear about the elephants of Mali. So yes, I'm going to tell you something of the story of nearly 20 years work. Initially, our burning question was to try and understand how this population of elephants had survived when all around them had disappeared and all around them on the same latitude even had disappeared. And then to try and use this information to help us work out what was required to ensure they survived into the future. So I'm just going to pick some key features of this story. But first, I just want to give you a flavor of the elephants and their habitat. So Joe, if we could get the little film clip up, thanks to National Geographic.
Absolutely. Let's get that going. And let me just pin my screen first. Actually, the sound's on my end, so we should be fine. So here we go.
Bye.
Right.
Amazing, Susan. What a landscape, and even better to see that large, group of elephants making their way through that landscape. Amazing.
Yeah, it's really, I can never get bored of watching that. So if we could perhaps have this first slide.
Absolutely. I'm going to do a quick pin of my audio or of my screen here just to make sure that we get that showing. And let's get that share underway. Okay. So Susan, you let me know if that's full screen for you.
It's actually not, no.
Presenter view, let's do a swap. How's that?
I'm sorry, that's better. Yes, that's better, thank you. Yes, okay, so we can move on to the next one. Next slide. So these maps are basically showing where our area is located in West Africa. The left-hand map shows the river Niger, the blue line, and just nestled under that bend in the river, there's the elephant range shown in brown, as identified by GPS collars that were placed on elephants by the NGO Save the Elephants in the early 2000s. So in the right-hand map, this shows the elephants where their area, their zone is found in that kind of southern margin of the Sahara called the Sahel. Next. So there's a big diversity of habitats in this area thanks to an ecological gradient ranging from sand dunes and plains in the north to more watered savanna in the south. There are escarpments, and as we saw in the film, and small lakes surrounded by patches of thicket forest. And so mirroring that is also a gradient of livelihoods. So we have mostly pastoralists in the north and gradually more agriculture as we go further south.
So Susan, I'm just going to pause you for just a second because I'm realizing that we're still getting a partial share. I want it to be nice and full screen for everybody. So give me one more second here to make sure we get that full screen.
Okay.
Let's try this. And one more thing there. How's that look for you, Susan? I think that's better.
That's better, yes. Great. Okay, next slide, please. So there's great, as well as having a great diversity of habitats, there's also a great diversity of people. Several different ethnicities share share the resources of this area and live together. Next. So our question was, how have these elephants survived? They're an internationally important elephant population and one of two populations of kind of desert adapted elephants, the other one being in Namibia. And they undertake the longest and most unusual circular migration of all elephants. And in the early 2000s, when we started this work, we thought there's probably around 500. Next. So if we zoom in to their area, you can see this is a satellite image, and the river can be seen in just bending around that bend in the river. And the scale bar shows the kind of scale of the area we're looking at here. And those coloured lines show the tracks of individual collared elephants, and they sketch out the migration route. And the first thing you notice is that there's areas that these elephants like an awful lot, where they spend a lot of time, and then they move between these areas very rapidly. So presumably these are areas that they don't like so much. And by comparing those areas, we could get some kind of understanding of what this migration is about. The next thing we noticed was that they spent the dry season in the north of the elephant range and the wet season in the south. And so to have a look at what was going on there, we zoomed in and you can see, and then we can see more clearly areas of sand dunes and plains and these little patches of dense forest that surrounded water holes. If we superimpose the tracks of the elephants, next, we can see that all over there, although they're ranging over this large area, they actually they're spending most of their time in those forests because there they can find water and food and they can hide and find shade. So next. So this is a picture of one of those water holes. You can see the water and the thick forest. And they stay there moving between these little lakes. And as one dries, they move on to another until they smell that it's raining further south. Next. And off they go. They migrate south. Next. Now, one of the features of the south is that they don't have any of these small lakes. So although the food is much better there, they can only stay there during the wet season. As soon as it stops raining, the water pools dry up and they have to go back north. The other feature of the south is that the areas where they inhabit seem to be much more clearly defined. So if we zoom into one of those, next, and then again, what we can see here, oops, yeah, there's those dark areas in the north, little hills, and those areas between them. The elephants just use one of those passes to get through those hills. And when we superimpose the villages, we can see why. That's the only one that doesn't have a village. And the other thing we discovered was that the area that they use had been actually protected by a local chief from being cleared for agriculture. And so this area provided a haven for those elephants. Next. This is a picture, this shows that pass through the hills on the left-hand side, and then the kind of general habitat of this area on the right-hand side. Next. So the general picture kind of shaping this migration was that the elephants are trying to find food and water throughout the year. And they're also trying to avoid human activity as much as possible. But that human activity has been encroaching more and more as habitats cleared and they're squeezed into the remaining areas. Next. So a good example is Lake Gossi. This is one of two large, very important and large lakes in the area. And in the 1980s, it was surrounded by thicket forest and very important for elephants. But by the 1990s, the forest had been cleared, a town had grown up on one side, irrigated gardens along the opposite banks, and the elephants no longer used the lake, and so were displaced to other areas. And so our conclusion was it seemed that we needed to act across the elephant range. We couldn't just focus solely on just a few areas. Next. But what can you do with a vast open populated landscape that's 3.5 times the size of Yellowstone, or about the size of Belgium and Luxembourg combined? There were no resources available, no political will, and we had absolutely no money. Next. And so it led us to think about the local people and wonder what they thought. And so we organized some community dialogues, initially with local leaders, to present our findings and ask them what they thought, whether they thought we were correct, and then to discuss their own experience of living with elephants and what they thought should be done. But the key finding from these dialogues that was really striking was that they didn't want elephants to disappear, because if elephants disappeared, it meant the environment was no longer good for people. This was really, really quite striking. Next. A more general attitude survey revealed the same thing. 78% didn't want to lose the elephants, 18% wouldn't mind, about 4% didn't know. Next. And we found the same results when we conducted village and household socioeconomic surveys, same kind of sentiments. And these surveys actually revealed two more key findings. The first key finding was that there was a very high degree of resource exploitation by outside commercial interests who are coming mostly from river towns, often over 100 kilometers away. And also that 96% of the cattle using the pastoral areas didn't actually belong to local people, but they belonged to wealthy town dwellers who amassed huge herds. And because there was no pasture near the towns, they hired impoverished herders to take them into these more remote areas to find pasture and water. So the second key finding was that while the individual clans and ethnicities had systems to manage natural resources to prevent overexploitation and resource degradation, they were reluctant to respect each other's systems and controls. And so effectively we had a free-for-all with people doing more or less what they wanted. And the result was environmental degradation. Next slide. So there was, as I said, there's a reduction of resources for all, and this generated increasing competition between elephants, humans, and their livestock. Next. The next thing we did was to hold a series of meetings open to everybody and to present these findings and discuss them in relation to people's daily challenges and challenges for the elephants. And we found that there was a very rapid consensus. So although you had these different clans and ethnicities with their own systems, they could rapidly be unified by sharing a common understanding of the problem. They also understood that any solution had to be transparent and equitable. And so we could then ask them, well, what do they think should be done? And they established their own systems, mirrored and modeled on traditional systems, where they elected a management committee of elders that was representative of all clans, ethnicities, and which created the rules of resource use and included habitat protection for elephants. And then they elected teams of young eco-guards to patrol and check that the rules were being respected. And we were able to do this because of Malian decentralization legislation, which puts resources legally in the hands of local people. So in the pastoral zones, they created pasture reserves, which were protected by fire breaks. Here in this photo, in the top two pictures, we see eco-guards dragging thorn bushes to mark the guideline. And at the bottom, there's teams clearing the vegetation from the fire break. And in the bottom right, there's the impact of the fire break, protecting all that pasture. Next. So the benefits were that local people were assured food for their livestock nearby all year round, and they could charge these outside herds for grazing access or by the head of livestock for access to water. And a little study showed that their livestock was healthier, gave more milk, produced more young, and was worth that much more, 50% more in the market. And revenue tended to be shared equally between the management committee, the eco-guards, and the women. Next. So this is just a little comparison of two very similar areas. One with resource management systems on the right and one on the left, where you could see all the cut trees. These are all cut by herders so that their animals can browse on branches which would otherwise be out of reach, but it actually causes quite a lot of damage to the trees. So not only do these systems regulate use, but they're also restoring habitat and the resilience of this whole system to environmental change. Next. And because there are more resources available, the women were able to develop small enterprises, such as harvesting wild foods, medicines, and fodder. And this kind of small cash makes a difference as to whether their children can go to school or not. So these systems were incredibly popular, and many communities were asking for help to do the same thing. And in 2011, it really seemed realistic that the whole elephant range could be protected by these community systems and that would be operating autonomously eventually. But after the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, Tuareg mercenaries returned to Mali, heavily armed, and reignited the separatist rebellion at the same time as a jihadist insurgency descended on the north of the country. And there was a coup in 2012. Government completely retreated from the elephant range and it became lawless, occupied by armed groups. Elephant poaching began, and for the first time, and we really feared it would run out of control because it seemed there was nothing to stop it. Next slide. So the local response was that community leaders declared, they issued edicts that all elephant poachers were thieves because they stole what belonged to local people. And the project engaged around 520 youth to form a vigilance network across the elephant range to look out for poaching and discover the identities of poachers. We could only pay small sums, about the equivalent of food for them and their families. And yet, despite the fact that armed groups were paying between $30 and $50 a day, none of our vigilance networks joined the armed groups because they felt that working for the project carried more status and was less risky. But in 2015, the epicenter of the conflict moved south into central Mali and elephant poaching escalated. 83 elephants were lost in 2015 alone, and armed enforcement was required. And so we worked with the government to create an anti-poaching unit from scratch that was able to work in this highly insecure area. It took 2 years, but a key step was to deliver a training that was based on supporting local communities. This had to be fundamental. You know, the whole anti-poaching unit had to be supporting those communities, and its activities had to be directed by local information so that they could be well targeted to where it's needed. And Chingeta Wildlife delivered this community-centered approach. Next slide. So how did it all work out? This graph along the bottom shows the timeline right from January 2012, when we witnessed the first poaching incident, right up to today. And on the vertical axis is the cumulative number of illegally killed elephants, poached elephants. And you can see that for the first 3 years, the local community structures were enough to contain poaching. But then in 2015, international trafficking networks started targeting the elephants. And we knew this because of the information that our eco guards were giving us. And it was escalating. And with a population of 500, this was really alarming. But 2 years later, once the anti-poaching unit became fully functional, poaching seems to have leveled off. So we're continually looking ways to reinforce this model. One example is shown in this slide. We can see in the north of the map, the river Niger bending around, and the little dots are villages and towns. The green is the elephant migration route, and the dashed line outlines what was an elephant reserve, but since the 1950s, but the only thing that it prohibited was elephant hunting, and this was never enforced. Everything else was allowed. And so we worked with government to try to enlarge the boundaries to cover the whole of the elephant range, and also to change the text, revise the text along the lines of a biosphere reserve model, so that key areas for elephant survival could be strictly protected, while the community natural resource management agreements would provide the rules for the multiple use areas, the majority of the reserve. And this would actually provide another level of legislative force to these community systems. And we started this in 2011, and it's about to pass through, become into law. It's been derailed by the coronavirus emergency. Joe, we've lost the
I think
visuals.
There we go. There was a font that it wanted me to download, but I think we're okay now.
Okay, I think you can do that later.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just to kind of pull it together a bit, to summarize, this graphic attempts to show the interplay between different activities, crudely kind of described as combination of bottom-up and top-down working together. So the actual action on the ground is ensured by the local resource management governance systems, which had been actually enabled by the national decentralization legislation. These provided the mechanism to be able to protect elephant habitat. And then as further emergencies or further opportunities arose, we could add in the anti-poaching enforcement unit and the protected area legislation to reinforce and give teeth to these systems. So this whole process was kind of guided by an understanding and seeing the problem of elephant survival is actually arising out of its wider environmental and social context. It could almost think that the fact we didn't know what to do at the beginning was almost an advantage, because it meant we had to actually listen closely to what was actually happening and then try and identify those kind of leverage points where small actions could make a big difference. And at the same time, reinforce those aspects which are actually working for us. So, for example, the attitude of the local people, and their understanding that human activity must respect environmental limits, the existence of the decentralization legislation, for example. And so by reinforcing these positive aspects, we're able to make the situation a bit more favorable for elephants. And so what began as an elephant conservation project ended up also delivering, improving livelihoods and improving social cohesion, because people had to work together to actually reap the rewards of these systems. And absolutely crucially, it killed two birds with one stone by providing occupations for unemployed youth, and also in regenerating some of these degraded environments to restore ecosystem resilience, which is vital in these very variable zones subject to environmental change. And there are also lessons for stabilization and security actors, because some of the key drivers of the conflict that's being experienced at the moment are poverty and youth unemployment. So it is a work in progress. We keep going, and sometimes quite astonished given the situation that we're still there, but the people are still there and it's providing benefits for them. The elephants are still there. So yes, we keep going. Next slide. So I'd just like to finish by flagging that this is a project of the Wild Foundation and the International Conservation Fund of Canada. Enormous thanks to all our partners who are helping us and have helped us throughout the year. And an enormous thanks to this festival and to all of you for listening.
All right, I'm going to come back from that screen share, Susan. Well, there we go. Okay. Well, Susan, thank you so much for sharing that story. I think it's so important to see these conservation activities happening in the field, to see that there are ups and downs. It's not always a smooth road. There's bumps in the way, but it's also good to see the resiliency of organizations, as well as the people who live in the areas that need to be protected. And I think we really see a common theme where most people don't want to exploit the environment around them. They know how important it is. They want to protect it, but sometimes, you know, a hand is needed with the tools and the resources to get it started. And then that community, that grassroots conservation can really flourish.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, so, you know, in the time that we have of COVID-19, it obviously changes a lot of things around the world. Do you have any updates on the situation in Mali right now?
Yes, it has hit the local town, and our project is working to help local populations, local people deal with it. It's working with a local NGO to provide awareness among local people about how to prevent the spread. But fortunately, because we're not a model based on tourism, we're not as badly hit as, you know, some of the others, like we were hearing from Olpejeta just now. We just have other challenges like mines and armed groups trying to annihilate each other and strong arm the local population and steal everything that can be stolen, really.
Yeah. And, again, it comes down to that limited resources and connecting those dots between, people who need those resources, but without the biodiversity there, those resources aren't going to last. So it really is a tough situation. But what are some things that give you hope with this project?
The thing that gives me enormous hope is I suppose it is the local engagement and these. And what always encourages me is that in back home, we're always trying to convince people of how important the environment is for our livelihoods, for our benefit, and that if we lose species, talking just now about rhinos, it's a huge indicator that we're destroying the very basics. We're kind of sawing off the branch that we're sitting on. But these people get it immediately. You don't have to explain that to them. They intuitively, they absolutely understand that. And I think that's something we have to understand a bit more. We in our urban lifestyles, we can understand it intellectually, but there needs to be a more sort of embodied, grounded understanding of that. And that's something that I learned from them. And the fact that we've managed to keep going despite the difficult security situation, that gives me hope. And the general raising of awareness, the international raising of awareness, I mean, you could see that people are actually beginning, there's a rising tide of increasing awareness of the importance of an intact environment. These ecosystems, you've got to have these intact ecosystems to be able to buffer environmental change. Environmental change is natural. But you need resilient, diverse, thriving ecosystems, and that's our insurance policy. That's our insurance policy for the future. So that's what gives me hope. And you've got to have hope, because otherwise it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You summed it up so well, Susan. Thank you so much for being patient with our slow start. Going from rhinos to elephants is pretty darn cool. Thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for sharing that story, a story that a lot of us may not have been aware of before. And it's one of many stories across the continent of Africa.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a real privilege, and thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much, Susan.